Let's call the meeting to order. Do we have any substitutions? Yes. Anderson Mason for Greg Turner. Is it the pleasure of the committee to take into consideration Bill number 15, an act respecting petroleum products pricing? All those in favour, please say yay. Against, nay. Carried. Minister, do you have any opening comments?
Mr. Chair, it's a pleasure to be here to have an opportunity to face questions from the opposition on Bill 15, an act respecting petroleum products pricing. I've got Tom McFarlane with me. I've got Heather Quinn. We're looking forward to it, and we might as well get going right away. Thank you.
Perfect.
Substitute in for Kevin Arsenault, please.
Member from Tracadie-Shiloh.
Mr. Chair, thank you to the staff and everyone here to debate this bill or to question this bill. So I know I got a couple of calls from people in my riding and I think even your riding, a lot of people called me, Mr. Minister, and they're just wondering, like, you know, it's a little bit technical, the bill, so they kind of just want to, they asked me, listen, can you ask them to break it down and then just go through it? So I'm just wondering if you could maybe just explain, in general terms, what's the, before this bill, what's the actual process the EUB has to go through, or what's actually in place now as legislation when it comes to gas prices? So when the market prices go up, how does that trigger the EUB and what they do?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, we'll have I'll give a brief overview, and then subject to being drilling down into areas that I might not hit. The folks in my riding, as I've had a conversation with it about this bill, it is a bill that has some technical components from it, and the folks in my riding speak very highly of the member from Tracadie-Shiloh and look forward to his next visit down in our area. So we'll have a chance, perhaps we could have a joint meeting, and we could bring folks together and have a conjoined meeting on the bill. Essentially what we're doing here is, it's no secret that energy issues are of a pretty significant nature, and there's a volatile market as it relates to fuel pricing. Evidenced most recently with a significant raise in the price of diesel oil, diesel fuel, and home heating oil. Now, we had anticipated that, and we've had conversations back and forth here on the legislature about the changing markets, futures, challenges and opportunities about fuel pricing, and how we can make sure that we're best positioned to have the most flexibility. And in a word, the Act is going to be offering flexibility. And I'm going to use a real quick example. Diesel fuel jumped up 68 cents a litre about a month ago, or thereabouts. It was a significant jump, and we saw in our neighbouring province of Nova Scotia that they did not jump the price of diesel fuel, but we immediately did here in New Brunswick. And there was a great cause for concern over that, and rightfully so, because we're saying, why in Sackville, New Brunswick, is diesel fuel 70 cents a litre more than in Amherst, Nova Scotia? Well, the reasoning behind that was the essence of why we had put this bill together months ago in anticipation of situations like this happening. There's the EUB has formulas that they operate under with which they come up with fuel pricing, diesel, home heating oil, a myriad of products. And they got a formula that they go through to do it, and that formula is similar, but there are nuanced differences between us and Nova Scotia. For example, in the case of that situation, the interrupter clause that we have in our our EUB operates under does not offer them any flexibility with which they can view an increase in price like that, or a decrease in price if that was the case, and determine whether this is a blip, whether it's an anomaly, whether it's a mistake. And we saw in Nova Scotia that they were able to hold and not immediately increase the price because their interrupter clause had flexibility. Now, what we did see was New Brunswick immediately raised the price because we did not have that flexibility, and therefore, over the course of a period of a week or so, we did see the price normalize and us come to within a few cents of diesel fuel in the province of Nova Scotia. Ultimately, we wind up in very, very similar positions as it relates to pricing with Nova Scotia or our other maritime partners. But this bill is meant to align us so that the flexibilities or the ability to operate with our EUB to theirs are homogenized so that we can see rises and falls in pricing very similar from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and Newfoundland. In an effort to not control prices whether they go up and down, that's subject to a much more complex equation and formulas, but to ensure that it's harmonized amongst our maritime partners so that we don't see neighboring jurisdictions with significant gaps and differences in pricing. From there, please drill in and we'll go through different components of it as it relates to specific components of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. So I do want to speak about the bill, and I do want to speak about the changes that you're bringing forward. But I just want people to understand what the mechanism, understand the mechanism that's in place now, because obviously gas prices vary from week to week. The UB, obviously, they've got a procedure that they've got to follow. So I just want people to understand what we have now, and then we're going to go on to the changes or kind of the tweaking that we want to do with the EUB. So I'm just, again, wondering if you could just explain exactly, people wondering, what do gas prices vary from week to week? Can you just describe the process or the steps that actually make it so that we, prices at the pumps are what they are every single Thursday?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, as the members opposite would appreciate, I'm going to try to do this in as simple a format as possible, because to go through the significant and complicated grid that winds up delivering us what a per litre price is would take up most of our day. Simply put, there's a formula that the EUB uses to determine what the price per litre is on a variety of petroleum products. That is determined through stock exchanges, harbour pricing, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just going to park that. At the end of the day, they then have a pretty prescriptive formula with which they then apply that price. They have a specific day of the week that they have to do it. They have a specific period of days that they have to maintain it. And in the midst of it, there is an interrupter clause where if the price of fuels goes up or down more than a variance of 6 cents per litre, they must immediately adjust and act accordingly, up or down. So at the end of that process, they get fed the information from the world markets. They then put that through a formula, come up with a per litre price. It's determined on a specific day. It stays in place for a number of days, and then based on fluctuations on that price within that period of time, an interrupter clause may or may not be applied. But that's what gives us our per litre price.
Thank you very much, Minister. So you've got the market price of crude oil, on the international market, and then you've got the refiner who actually buys that crude. He refines it. He sells it to the wholesaler. Wholesaler then distributes it to retailers, and retailers sell it to us. Are those the main actors in the whole scheme of things?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, yes.
So when the EUB, so when it triggers, when they've got to go through that process, or when it triggers that process, the fluctuation in prices, are we talking about the global price of crude oil, or are we talking about the prices that the refiner spits out once he's done his process of converting the oil to home heating fuel or diesel gasoline, for example?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, it's not the price of crude, it's the price of diesel or the price of gasoline that would be determining that price, not the refined process.
So it's the price, so it's once the refiner is done with his work, the price that he puts out there saying, listen, this is what it costs me to produce diesel, and then from there, that's what's determined for the wholesaler?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, it is the market price of a refined product as a result of having been processed in a refinery, but it's not, it's the market price, not specific to any one refinery's process. So that's a larger picture about market price upon refinement.
Thanks, Minister. That helps a little bit, because obviously in the bill we're talking about the margins between the wholesaler and the retailers. I just kind of want to go before that and say, okay, with the refiners, like those who get the crude, you know, ready for us to use it. What about their margins? How does the EUB have any say in their margins, or are they completely independent and they determine what the price is to get everything ready?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, the refinery sells to the market, and whatever the market will bear will determine the price.
Okay, perfect. So we're subject to obviously the prices that the refiner comes out with and says, okay, listen, this is the price of diesel, this is the price of home heating fuel and stuff like that. Okay, that's clear. Now we can move on. Now, wholesalers here in the province. So the refiners, they sell to the wholesalers. Do we have wholesalers here in the province, or is it like, how does that, just explain a little bit that industry. Are we talking about, like, is Esso, Shell, are they considered wholesalers also at the same time as retailers? I don't know if you can just kind of shed light on that.
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, there are a number of wholesalers that operate in the province of New Brunswick.
Is it possible to name a few, just
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, in such a short period of time, you've done a great job of becoming my critic because you've answered your own question in the previous one, Esso, Shell, Irving Oil, etc.
Thank you very much. Okay, so at the same time, so we've got the refiners who are Irving, and I don't know, I think, I don't know if Shell's in that game also. I think so, I'm not sure. Or they might fly under another name. And they're also the wholesalers. So that's where the EUB kicks in, where it's like, okay, now that the wholesalers know what price they're buying the fuel for, that's where we start to regulate things. So at that point, just so how the margins between the wholesaler and the retailer, I don't know if you could kind of explain that. Is that set beforehand? Is that something that's revised every single week, or is that something that's done every 6 months and it just you run with it?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, separate and apart from the weekly determination of per litre prices, that margin is set on a, I think it's every year or 2 years that's done in a separate process apart from regular per litre fuel pricing.
As the prices of gasoline, for example, they go up and down every single week, do the margins stay the same between the wholesaler and the retailer?
Mr. Chair, the answer is yes.
We're just going to stand and just kind of just go back and forth instead of getting up and sitting down. It'll be a lot quicker and more efficient. So the interrupter clause, or the bill that you guys want to bring in, how will that affect the margins between the wholesaler and the retailers? If you do set a maximum level, will that have an impact on those margins, or who's going to take the hit on this?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, the interrupter is related to the benchmark price. The margins are determined and added in addition to that. So that's already set, and then the interrupter determines the per litre price. Margins, of course, are in addition to that. So it's not a cost that's passed along or eaten or whatever the case may be.
But if the market, if the refiner says this is a market price of the fuel, he's got to pass that cost on to the wholesaler, who's got to pass obviously that cost on to the retailer. But if there's an interrupter clause that jumps in and says, well, no, this is the maximum amount that you can sell it, someone's got to adjust their price.
Mr. Chair, the member opposite. In any regulated market, a maximum pricing level does create a situation where a retailer could be compromised on margin. That's one of the purposes of this bill, and we can get into it as we get further, about timing, because one of the things that we're talking about changing is becoming a lot more reactive on timing as it relates to pricing and whatnot. But to answer the question, in a regulated market with fluctuations, there is an opportunity for retailers to have margins compromised.
Now, don't get me wrong. The lower the price of gasoline, the better it is for consumers and people here in New Brunswick, and that's the goal for everyone. But obviously, there's an impact to small business, and you know, I don't puts us in a hard situation as legislators to kind of pick sides, because I don't want to be here to defend the retailers, but at the same time, you know, I don't want to see them get dinged in a certain way with this bill. Have you consulted with the retailers? Like, were they made aware that, you know, this is what we're working on, and this is going to be the impacts? I think they've got an association, if I'm not mistaken, the smaller. So, what kind of concerns did they bring up when you actually had a talk with them?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, yes, indeed, conversations have taken place with the Retail Association in an effort to go through a lot of the nuances of the bill. Conversations took place, and there was discussion throughout the entire bill, but the fact of inclusion of market adjusters was something that was received well, and overall, the Retail Association was informed of the direction that we're going in with this bill.
Thank you very much, Minister. So, you know, obviously because of world tendencies, we're kind of, you know, big is better. We're seeing less and less of these smaller retailers. But I know in my region, for example, when I've talked to a couple, their concern is that sometimes they're in a situation where they've bought from the wholesaler at a certain price, and then, you know, obviously the price at the pumps or the maximum allowable is actually under. So either they're selling for peanuts or almost selling just at cost. So how do we control that? Like, how do we make adjustments without actually hurting them and saying, well, geez, I'd rather just keep, you know, my oil in the tanks and not sell them because I'll just wait till the prices go up?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite. You talk about balance, and that's a very important part of the conversation, and there are concerns there, and when you say that, why leave it, well, let's leave it in the ground rather than sell it, I'll just wait for the price to go up. But we also have to look at the balance of it, where when the price goes up, the opposite is true. Timing can work in favor of the retailer as well. And there are times when you buy low and sell high, and there's other times where the price is lower. So overall, there's a balancing component to it. But keep in mind, the whole concept here is to try to bring as much flexibility as we can in, to normalize ourselves with other Atlantic provinces, and ultimately to ensure that we are bringing fuel at the best possible cost to the consumers of the province of New Brunswick.
So I don't know how Nova Scotia does it. I don't know if, again, like you said, you know, like if there is a cap put on, you mentioned that the retailer was the one that, you know, would have to adjust his prices. What about the wholesaler in all of this? Like, why is it only the retailer that's being asked to kind of, not necessarily, I don't want to use the word take the hit, but kind of have to adjust? Especially the fact that, and again, I don't want to make a huge thing with this, maybe there's nothing there, but if, for example, we'll take Irving. So if Irving is a refiner, he's a wholesaler, why is it the smaller retailer that has to adjust his price at the end of the day?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, quite frankly, within the role of government, we set the maximum price for the retailer, which is what the consumer pays, which is what the focus is that we have, which is what is at the essence of the majority of this bill in order to normalize that and bring balance into the system. We don't set along the supply chain. We set the maximum price as it relates to the consumer, and therefore that's what all of this discussion and conversation is about. This bill doesn't pertain to wholesale, that wholesale component to it, because it's about our retail customer primarily.
Thank you. No, and I understand that, and you know, again, like I said, it's a good bill. I think the spike protection is a good thing for consumers, even for the trucking industry, all that kind of stuff. It's probably the thing that, you know, needs to be done, especially when, you know, people on this side of the border see that in Nova Scotia they're paying a lot less, and it just, you know, it just fuels the anger. Sorry for the pun. My only issue with that is just to, you know, I kind of want to make sure that the process in there is fair for everyone, and I don't want to see, you know, smaller business or that you know, that industry being hit with this regulation, but it's kind of like something that's necessary. I want to go back a little bit. I'm a little bit everywhere here on this, but I want to go back on the fact that, so again, just for the average New Brunswicker, they see that every Thursday, you know, the gas at the pumps change. How will this bill, like the adjustment part, like give them more flexibility? So instead of changing the fuel price on Thursday, for example, I think from what I understand, that they're going to have an extra few days to kind of see where the market goes, see if actually there's going to be a dip. When the EUB sets the price as it is today on the Thursday, are those prices set for the week, or can there be an adjustment midweek?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, the way it works now is when those prices are set on a Thursday, they're there for a 5-day period of time, and they stay set at that price unless, of course, there's a significant swing. And at that point, the current legislation has us set so that the interrupter clause must immediately kick in and reflect whatever that up or down price is, if it's more than 6 cents a litre up or down. So with this bill, and this speaks to the harmonization part of it, that we're going to change and harmonize the day with which those prices are set with Nova Scotia, harmonize the amount of time that they're set with Nova Scotia, and offer the flexibility as it relates to the interrupter clause to the EUB, so that they can take that time to review and see, like I said, blip, anomaly, mistake, whatever the case may be. It's important to note that timing does give the impression of significant swings in fuel pricing, but we did an analysis, and from January 1st until September sometime, we did an analysis on a per litre annualized price of fuel between regular fuel between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And although you could see 10 cent, 15 cent, 12 cent differences per litre at the pump at different periods of time, the annualized average per litre cost was 1.7 cents per litre different than Nova Scotia. And that's because when we set on one day, and we have a set period of days that we are, and the Nova Scotia utilities on a different cycle, then we may go up, they stay down, but then when we get to the end of the cycle, we go down and they stay up. So at the end of the day, it averaged out to be a 1.7 cents per litre difference between Nova Scotia and the province of New Brunswick. In fact, during that same period of time, I believe we were actually even under Prince Edward Island by a little bit. But at the end of the day, you know, it doesn't bode well to, say, like I said, live in Sackville, New Brunswick, look over at Amherst, Nova Scotia, and see those big swings. Plus, the big thing is the flexibility in the interrupter clause. And I think we'll see diesel fuel, we're sitting at about a 10 cent per litre difference between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick on diesel fuel. I'm very encouraged about the interrupter piece that we're putting into this legislation, and I would really look forward to seeing the annualized per litre cost of diesel year over year, because I think that'll bring us even closer and more in line over the course of that time.
Thanks, Minister. So will the 5-day period stay with this interrupter clause, or will that also, will there be flexibility in that they can change it like after 2 days or 3 days?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, the filing day of the week is going to change, and this is going to go to a 7-day period, the same as Nova Scotia. At any point within that period of time, if the prices take big swings, the interrupter clause, instead of immediately kicking in, that flexibility will kick in, and our utility will be able to watch it until we get to the next period of time when prices need to be adjusted.
And again, the UB is going to set the maximum rate for fuel prices at the pumps, even after the interrupter clause?
Mr. Chair, the answer is yes.
Perfect. Okay, let's just go on to the board of EUB. Just kind of want to understand how, like, the composition of the board, like how do they, are we talking about a group of 5 or 6 people? Are they always the same people that meet on a weekly basis to determine, you know, the prices of gasoline? Can you just kind of shed light on that a little bit?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, I'm talking even faster than the microphone. There now. We're moving today. I know. I should speak in soft, dulcet tones so that we can be heard on a better basis. 5-person board, and it is a board not unlike a variety of different boards throughout the entire province of New Brunswick. There are chair, vice chairs, members of the board, serve for periods of time, come and go as time permits. There's a staff associated with it, staff of review, all of the data, like I said, according to the formula that they use, they make recommendations, and then the board sets the maximum pricing for fuel. They also, and just for your edification, and probably are already aware, they deal with the natural gas distribution pricing, they deal with NB Power rate increases or decreases, they deal with a variety of different things in addition to the maximum fuel price.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm glad you mentioned the NB Power rates in the EUB. We'll have a talk on that, but not today. We'll leave that for another day. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We're talking a lot about Nova Scotia and the fact that they brought in that interrupter clause, but what about other provinces? Like does Quebec, Ontario, and Western provinces, do they also have something in place for spike protection?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, it's important to make the distinction that they didn't bring it in. They had it, and they had flexibility within their interrupter clause, right? We have it as well with no flexibility, so that's what we're talking about here. Across country jurisdictionally, it's the Atlantic Canadian provinces that have interrupter clauses, and that's where it resides.
Thank you very much. I see on page 3, section 14, 2.1, that the board may, on request of the wholesaler or retailer, conduct a review of the cost of carbon adjuster. So is that a way of saying that they could actually not necessarily appeal it, but kind of question the EUB for putting in the interrupter clause?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, no, that has nothing to do with the interrupter clause.
Well, can you explain then 14.21 why you put that in the bill?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, quite simply put, it's an opportunity for the wholesaler and the retailer to ask for an appeal because they don't feel like that margin reflects the reality of the marketplace.
Now, I imagine it's probably the same reason why you put 14.2.2 in there also?
Mr. Chair, yes.
Jeez. Thank you very much, Minister, for that answer. So when they do put in an appeal, like, I mean, does that happen often? Like, are there any Does a wholesaler or retailer, do they question the EUB on the margins often, or do they just accept it for as it is? Like, I'm just wondering, what's the purpose of putting this in here in the legislation? Is this something that came from the wholesaler or the retailer, or is it just something that you put in just to kind of make the process better?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, carbon adjusters and market adjusters are new, and we've always had that capacity for them to have the conversation about the wholesale margin, but considering the emerging situation we have as it relates to carbon and market adjusters, we just included that as well.
When would you like this to be in place? Like, obviously, you know, you tabled a bill a few weeks ago. If it does pass third reading and gets royal assent, is there a start date to the interrupter clause?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, I'm sure the member opposite understands that we're a government of action and seek urgency with every file that we embark upon. So upon receiving royal assent, it would immediately go into place, and the EUB would accordingly reflect the amendments to the Act in their deliberations.
Thank you very much, Minister. Again, that could be questioned, that you're a government of action, but you know, it's Friday morning, and we won't get into that today. I'll let my colleague, if he'd like to really hammer you guys on that issue. So the Nova Scotia legislation, what's the difference? Like, I didn't actually go through the whole legislation, but did we really mirror our legislation with theirs, or are there a slight difference between both?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, I wouldn't call it a direct mirror image. What we've done and gone through the best practices, and in the course of operating, we've realized that timing is an issue. We've realized that the length of time with which the per litre price stands is an issue, and we've realized that the interrupter clause, no more than in the last month with what we've seen with diesel fuel, is an issue. So those, we went through and found those key components that Nova Scotia had in their legislation that offered flexibility, that would turn around and then offer us the same flexibility to allow that harmonized price back and forth across the board between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And then from what I understand too, they've been looking at certain components about the carbon adjusters and market adjusters that we have in our legislation. Now, I don't know the specifics on that, but it was almost a comparable where they're looking at our legislation to see where they can maybe harmonize with us as well. Ideally with us, even though the per litre price was only a 1.7 cents difference, those big swings were what we wanted to normalize. It's important to note that this legislation that we're putting forward, if passed, won't stop swings in fuel prices, either up or down, but it's meant in order to put some more controls in place and offer some flexibility so that we can read and react to situations in a way that can be more beneficial to New Brunswickers.
Thank you very much, Minister. So basically, those are my questions for, don't go too far. These are my questions on the bill. Again, I think it's a good thing for consumers and, you know, the trucking industry and everyone to be able to protect them from surges. My only concern is, again, with the retailers. I'm a little bit concerned for smaller businesses. I'm not sure that there was proper consultation. I know the minister kind of bragged about the fact that they're a government of action, but they're also a government who isn't known for consulting. And I'm a little bit concerned with them, their margins, and how that's going to affect them, because I know obviously it's a struggle right now with the fluctuation. I mean, it's just the world market now is up and down every single week, and you know, every Thursday everybody's kind of just on Facebook saying, I'm just wondering if the prices are going to go up or down, and you know, if they do go up, then people say tank up now, or gas, you know, fuel up now, and if they do go down, everybody says, well, wait until Friday. My last question or two, I just want to come back, yeah, or two. I just want to come back to again, just, you know, if I'm going to go and have a coffee at Tim Hortons this weekend, the question I get, make it two, okay. The questions that I keep getting asked are like, how can we explain just to, you know, just to your average New Brunswicker, how come prices, you know, go up and down? Like, I know there's a formula at world markets, but how do we as legislators explain to them, listen, this is, you know, why are gas prices so crazy? Like, why do they go up and down? And I can't answer them. So I'm just wondering if you can maybe give me some Coles notes to be able to help explain to the people of, you know, my Tim Hortons, say, okay, listen, this is why the, you know, price goes up and down every single Thursday.
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, the answer to that is no, jokingly, because it is significantly complex, I know. And as legislators and as MLAs, we all find ourselves in the coffee shops and having conversations. And who would have thought that $1.60, $1.70 was a good deal on gas, right? I mean, we saw some incredible and phenomenal things happen that took fuel prices and turned them into something that was just like a spinning wheel. It was so hard to predict. So I wish there was a silver bullet or a magic wand or some way that we could sit down and say, it's simple, folks. It's a result of this, this, and this. It is much more complex than that. But, you know, we've always had that conversation about involving, and before being a politician, I'm sure the member opposite as well would sit around and say, well, how do they come up with gas prices? Well, it is a commodity. Okay, first of all, it's important to understand, and as New Brunswickers, we look and we think, because we have the largest refinery in Canada sitting in our province, we think that, you know, it comes out of the ground and it's all figured out there, in St. John. Well, no, it's not. It's a global calculation based on commodity pricing to begin with. Now, I certainly am not capable of giving an answer as it relates to the stock markets, their fluctuations, and how per barrel pricing comes up for oil. But it's done through that situation, and as a result, that gets fed through markets, and then that's where pricing winds up getting to EUBs, where they have a formula that they come up with a per litre price. The biggest thing I run into when I'm sitting at the coffee shops is that people are concerned about being gouged. And if they are being gouged because of commodity pricing going up and down in a New York Stock Exchange or a harbor situation that's beyond our control, that's one thing. But it's important for us to, as legislators, when we're at that coffee shop, to say that our job is to ensure that the utility board at the provincial level has all the tools they can to ensure that that New Brunswick consumer is protected. And when that formula lands at the EUB, we need to make sure that we give them all the tools they possibly can have to have the most flexibility to ensure that we can keep that per litre price as low as we possibly can for the consumer, and that's exactly what we're doing here with this legislation. So I could tie it up in a bow really quick like that and tell you really nothing as it relates to the schematics of how that price comes up, but only about what our job is as in the Department of Energy and us as a legislature to ensure that we make sure that this is the most affordable it can possibly be. Now, I mean, good heavens, we've got worldwide conflicts, constriction of natural resources, we've got a variety of different things. Kerosene, you're probably looking at me thinking, are we talking the 1800s now? Kerosene is not something that we've run anything with in a long time. However, kerosene is a key ingredient to blending to diesel fuel, and in colder climates, it is an additive that allows that fuel to not freeze so much. Well, there's a little science lesson for you, but the economics of it is that the price of kerosene went through the roof, and that was the key reason behind the diesel fuel price going up 68 cents a litre. You see it going up 68 cents a litre, and you start thinking, who's gouging us? Well, there is usually an explanation behind it, and it goes beyond the scope of the province of New Brunswick. What we do is put legislation in place to the best of our ability to bring fairness, balance, and protect our New Brunswick citizens.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm encouraged by the fact that, you know, you want to give tools or, you know, give new tools or as many tools as possible to the EUB to be able for them to do their work. I'm just wondering if that was your motivation when you actually wrote them a letter last year to intervene, or when you actually passed legislation to actually completely exclude them, for example, from the Mactaquac project. So it's so it's So from my understanding, and I'm going to conclude on this, really where the price fluctuates is between the wholesaler and the retailer. That's where there's variance, because obviously the transportation cost. The wholesaler, he buys the fuel from the refiner at the market price. So whether he buys it from Shell or Irving, there should be a market price there. After that, then what goes into determining the final price at the pump? Well, it's all the costs that are associated with the wholesaler bringing it to actual, to the vendor. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, there's a lot of components to that supply chain that we don't have eyes on. And actually, staff did a great job of just explaining to me the fact that the refiner sells to a wholesaler. We don't have eyes on that transaction. Then to a retailer. We don't have eyes on that transaction. That's a private transaction between two. But we do have the, and then of course, then it's sold at a retail level with which it's regulated by our EUB. Now, there is opportunities within that system now for anybody in that supply chain to say, because we're basically taking an idea about what we think those prices are. We know what market value is. We've got an idea about what the sale prices are all through that supply chain. But in the event that the wholesaler or a distributor or anybody feels like we're off, then they have the ability to go to the EUB and say, we feel like that margin doesn't properly reflect everything. And as I finish, the member opposite did mention a letter. I can't let you off with it. I sat here, I tried, but I can't. Had you mentioned both letters I had written to the EUB, I would be a little bit more forgiving, but it seems like nobody ever brings up the fact that when we saw great fluctuation in fuel pricing, and New Brunswickers facing significant concerns about that, there was a letter that went asking the EUB if we could have a look at any ways possible. We've had eyes on this situation for a long time, and I said in an interview not too long ago, legislation that's on the floor of the legislature today wasn't written the day before yesterday. We've had a view to this. We've seen this coming. When we saw it, a letter was written asking to the EUB what type of options do we have. And they came back and quite frankly said that there was very little flexibility there. So a lot of that is the reason why we've got. So essentially a letter I've written to the EUB has led us to a bill that is going to bring relief to the province of New Brunswick and New Brunswickers at the pump. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Minister, seeing as you like to write letters to the EUB, I encourage you to actually write them another letter, asking them to withdraw their demand to increase power rates from 8.9%, especially after the Auditor General came out the other day and said that NB Power made $80 million in profit this year. So, and if you need help to draft, I could actually co-sign it. It'd be my pleasure to do that. So, Mr. Chair, these are all the questions that I have for the time being. I'll let my colleague take over, and I just might come back at the end and finish her up. Thank you.
Thank you. Member from Fredericton South.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning through you to the Minister and his staff. So I want to specifically drill down into this new thing that the bill creates, that Enact Respecting Petroleum Producing Pricing creates in terms of the carbon adjuster, something that this bill would empower the EUB to or authorize the UB to add a surcharge to the calculation of the regulated price for gasoline and diesel, which, as I read the minister's speech at second reading, is designed to cover the costs associated with Irving Oil Refinery's requirement to achieve compliance with the clean fuel standard in starting in July 2023. So I want to start with the minister said in his second reading speech, Mr. Chair, that implementation of the clean fuel standard will cause the Irving Oil Refinery to incur significant costs to comply. So I was surprised by that, Mr. Speaker, because it suggests he knows how they intend to comply and what their specific costs are going to be, or if there will be any costs at all. So I want to start with, just to set the context, if the minister could explain what is the objective of the federal clean fuel standard.
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, quite simply put, to reduce the carbon intensity of fuel.
Well, it is intended to do that, but at the same time, Mr. Chair, if you read the federal government's rationale anyways, it's to provide a market incentive to the refineries to reduce their life cycle emissions of their products and to incentivize innovation in clean fuel technologies to achieve what the minister said, to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuels produced at the refinery. So what standard will Irving Oil have to meet on July 1st, 2023? How much of a change in their intensity of carbon?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, I don't have the answer to that question.
So there's a schedule, Mr. Chair, for the refineries, all of them, and it works off of a baseline of it is intensity, so it's the amount of carbon per unit of energy content, which they measure in millions of joules. So they're working off of a baseline of 94.8 grams of carbon per billion joules of energy content in the gasoline or diesel produced at the refinery. So that's the baseline. I'm surprised that the minister doesn't know this, given that he said in his speech that this was going to result in significant costs to the Irving Oil Refinery to comply. So there is a schedule, and it starts this summer, this coming summer, and it increases gradually over time. So the first unit of reduction from that 94.8 grams of carbon in every million joules of gasoline or diesel is a reduction of 3.5 grams per million joules in the summer. So does the minister have any information that regarding the costs of complying with this initial target for 2023?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, this is not necessarily something that's looked at in an annualized fashion, but rather the holistic period over a runway of time in order to comply with standards that are going to require the reduction of emissions and the investment that's going to be required to do so. There's significant capital investment that's going to be required in order to accomplish those goals, not unlike the fact that they've purchased a hydrogen electrolyzer. There's significant expense that's being put in place there at this particular moment. So we know that in order to be in line with those Clean Fuel Standard Act, there is significant costs that will be borne by them, and I would look at it as though it's annualized over a period of time versus one particular fiscal year.
Mr. Chair, can the minister outline what opportunities for compliance the oil refinery has, and which of those opportunities the refinery has indicated to him that they intend to pursue?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, there's a number of options: blending renewable fuels, the addition of electrolyzers for the purpose of generating hydrogen, and also in buying credits. But it's important to understand that that's not reviewed by the department. That's under the auspice of the UB.
So, just to elaborate on that a bit, Mr. Chair, to make it clear, as the minister said now and in his speech at second reading, there's three compliance categories that the refinery could pursue. One are taking projects to reduce the life cycle carbon intensity of their gasoline and diesel fuels. They can do that through carbon capture and storage. They could do that through incorporating on-site renewable electricity generation into their process, or co-processing, so that's one. The second category is they could decide to supply low-carbon fuels by increasing the amount of ethanol that they currently add in their gasoline, so up the percentage. We all know there's ethanol in the gasoline. You see that at the gas pumps when you fill up, and they could increase that. On the diesel side, they could start incorporating some biodiesel into that, similar to the idea of ethanol and gasoline. Third opportunity is supplying fuel or in addition to advanced vehicle technology, which means, for example, they could install charging stations for electric vehicles at their gas stations. So actually not do anything at the refinery, but this would count towards their compliance through some kind of tortured calculation that the federal government's come up with. Barring any of those three options, then the refinery also has the opportunity, if they don't do anything and take advantage of any of those three options in terms of compliance, they can buy credits on a regulated credit market based on reductions in intensity that others have done above and beyond the requirement. They buy the credit and use that. So of these, to comply, so of these options, is the minister familiar with which one the refinery intends to utilize to comply with the clean fuel standard?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, a number of items that we're aware of. They're investing in charging networks. They're investing in the electrolyzer for hydrogen. You, at length, the member opposite at length went through a number of different categories, but it's important to clarify that, you know, the feds set out each of those categories. It's not provincially put together. What we've seen and what we expect is that the feds will work with the utility to, or the refineries across the country to put together the categories, and the refineries will put together the plans that they have. We've seen some action taking place tangibly already here in New Brunswick. Most likely we'll see more to come as it continues because it's federally mandated and coming down the pipe. At the end of the day, though, it's also important to remember that each and every one of those have significant costs associated with it, so adjusters are a part of that process as well.
So, Mr. Chair, what I'm hearing from the minister is he hasn't seen a compliance plan from the refinery as yet. Is that true?
Here, it's important that, let's look at that question. The feds are putting together these regulations. The feds are putting together the categories for compliance. This is a private corporation that's operating within the framework of what the federal government is doing. It's not necessarily the fairest question to say we don't know about what their plan is. We are aware, and like I've said, of some tangible steps that they're taking. We know that they're working towards it. But it would be no different than federal governments not being aware of forestry management agreements that we would have as it relates to forestry operations in New Brunswick. The jurisdictions wouldn't allow that level of cross-pollination, so to speak, but that's being put together by the feds to be implied upon the refineries in the country of Canada. Those plans will be shared with the feds. That being the case, I did stand here the last time and say that there are some tangible things that we see being done, and no doubt we'll be involved with it, but it wouldn't be correct to say that it's us as the province putting together these standards and these regulations and these categories for industry.
So, Mr. Chair, the minister is arguing that this carbon adjuster is required because the refinery will incur significant costs for compliance. So what is this evidence that they're going to incur significant costs to justify the need of the carbon adjuster that's provided for in this bill?
Mr. Chair, for heaven's sakes, if you lived under a rock, you might be able to ask a question like that. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, the member opposite has to understand what significant capital costs would be involved with putting together the transition to deal with the Clean Fuel Standards Act. This is absolutely transformational. This is not something that costs millions. This is something that costs billions. So it's not. It's well within the ability for us to put together projections that there will be significant costs associated with the ability for the refineries to comply with the Clean Fuel Standards Act. To say anything different or to cast doubt that it will bring significant cost would give an indication that somebody isn't really paying attention to what the capital investments would be required to comply. The member opposite should know more than anybody else that if you were looking at transitioning into clean economies, the opportunity is there, the requirement is there, the responsibility is there for us to do it, but the expense is going to be there as well. So to put a carbon adjuster in place is simply a reflection of this government's recognizing that those significant costs are going to be there, and so therefore an adjuster needs to be put in place. So quite frankly, let's start talking about the reality that there isn't a person that's sitting on this legislature floor with even a cursory knowledge of energy transition that wouldn't say we're looking at billions and billions of dollars that will be borne by an industry. So we want to get there. Let's ensure that we put things in place that make sense and allow that transition to take place.
Mr. Chair, is the minister suggesting this is going to cost the Irving Oil Refinery billions and billions of dollars to comply with the Clean Fuel Standard?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, again, I'm going to bring the member opposite back to the conversation about the fact that we're looking at an industry. Irving Oil is a refinery here in the province of New Brunswick. There are refineries all throughout the country of Canada. This is the Clean Fuel Standard Act is national in its approach. The member opposite takes great pleasure in trying to bring everything back to an Irving Oil, New Brunswick-specific situation, and we need to talk beyond that. It could cost them significantly. It will cost them significantly. An electrolyzer to move into the hydrogen environment. We're not talking about changing the engine in a Chevy Cavalier here. We're talking about transitioning to a new economy that is green and clean, and to say that there is not significant expense associated with that would be naive and irresponsible, because it's going to cost a lot of money. So as a government, we need to be there to stand and ensure that that industry is able to transition throughout, and that's why we put adjusters in place.
Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, the minister just a little while ago said we need to concentrate on the New Brunswick situation. When I asked him about what the compliance strategy or plan might be of the Irving Oil Refinery, he said that was a federal thing. We need to focus on New Brunswick. I'm focusing on New Brunswick here. What I'm trying to get at is why the carbon adjuster is actually required, and the minister has simply argued this because there's significant cost to comply. Anyone, Mr. Chair, who has followed the the compliance of large industry with new pollution control regulations knows that in many, many cases, what ends up is the industry makes money, more money. They profit from pollution prevention because so often the changes that are made increase their efficiency of operations, reduce waste, and there's so many examples over time, Mr. Chair, where that has happened. So of course there are costs, but those costs often turn out represent an investment that provides an actually significant return to the company and increases their profitability over time while complying with the pollution control requirements. Books have been written on this, literally. And in fact, I can think of one called Profit from Pollution Prevention that documents case after case after case in Canada across different industrial sectors, big, heavy industrial sectors, of when they had to comply with new environmental legislation, new pollution controls that were regulated, that in the end it increased their profitability because pollution often, Mr. Chair, results from, well, waste and inefficiencies in the process. And so here there are tremendous opportunities as well. Not only that, Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, and as the Minister mentioned, one of the options for Irving Oil, the refinery, is to purchase credits from those who have gone above and beyond the requirements in the law, and you know, further reduce the intensity of the carbon per amount of gasoline or diesel that they produce than they're required to, so they have surpluses so they can sell credits. Knowing the way Irving Oil works, I have no doubt, I wouldn't be surprised, I should say, if that's what they're thinking, that they're going to make the kind of investments that will enable them to exceed the modest, let me underline, the modest requirements of the Clean Fuel Standard, Mr. Chair, so that they generate surpluses. So they have credits to sell on the market as a revenue source, Mr. Chair, to offset as another revenue source into the refinery based on the investments to meet the standard. And they'll try and undoubtedly they will want to, who wouldn't want to maximize that, the ability to sell credits, Mr. Chair. So the Minister is only looking at one side of the equation here. That's why I asked about the compliance plan and what that looks like. So the Minister seems unfamiliar with what the actual regulation requires in terms of reductions. You know, let me just review it. By this year, we're going from 94.8 grams of carbon content, carbon dioxide equivalent content per million joules of energy within the gasoline or diesel, and reduce that by 3.5 grams. 3.5 grams. Then the next year, 5 grams. And the year after that, 6.5 grams. So that by the time we get to 2031, Mr. Chair, the carbon intensity of Irving Oil's fuels and any other refineries' fuels in this country will be down to 80.8 grams. So a reduction of 14 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per million joules. So from 94.8 today to 80.8. That's what we're looking at over the 6 years or 7 years here. So those are the numbers. We haven't got a plan. We don't know what the compliance plan is. So the Minister can't know that there are significant costs involved, and he certainly doesn't seem to understand that there are significant opportunities for Irving Oil to generate revenue out of their investments to comply with this regulation. So has the Minister got any knowledge about what the costs, what Irving Oil, if they generate credits to sell on the credit market out of this, what revenue would be generated by on the sale of credits? What's the value of a credit in this system?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, let's review a couple of things that were said here. We went on, that was a lengthy dissertation that really addressed issues that go far beyond the scope of this bill. Member opposite just said in his statements that no doubt the companies will make investments in order to have some nefarious plan to do something that's ill-gotten and created some sort of a conspiracy that I didn't even understand when he got to the end of it. But I did hear him when he said he knows that the companies are going to make those investments. Those aren't $100 investments. Those aren't $1 million investments. He knows darn well that those are significant investments. The federal government themselves understood that and recognized that pricing will go up. They did acknowledge that in their own analysis, in their own research. And at the end of the day, the industry has the ability, under this carbon adjuster, to come before who? Government? No. Come before the EUB and say, here's our receipts. I'm really oversimplifying it for the member opposite. We spent this much money, therefore we feel like we qualify. And it's not a government, it's not a premier, it's not an ordering council that's going to make that decision. It's the EUB based on clear standards, and so to talk about this as a way that the industry is going to, in some sort of a backhanded way, get something is disingenuous, Mr. Chair. The truth of the matter is, all folks have recognized that significant investment is going to be required to comply with the Clean Fuel Standards Act. To talk about it in nebulous terms is really, really inappropriate. At the end of the day, can I put a dollar figure in front of you right here now? No, but to say that we don't know if they're going to have that much expense, that's really just not something that I don't think anybody with any level of understanding of economics would take at face value. The truth of the matter is the expense is going to be high. The federal government recognizes it. They can take that expense and capital investment to, ironically, clean up the environment, like the member opposite should be significantly excited about and talking about more than anything else, and then take those investments, put them in front of the EUB, and determine whether they qualify for carbon capture or not. At the end of the day, that's the simple part of it. The discussion around everything else is really taking our focus off of a bill that is going to allow industry to feel like they can make the investments to bring us to a greener, cleaner technology, and then have an opportunity to make the case as to whether that earns them credits or not. Mr. Speaker, all of the other conversation has been in a direction completely other than the focus and the intention of this bill.
So, Mr. Chair, the minister keeps talking about one side of the ledger here, the investments. So those are costs in the short term. If you start selling credits because you've significantly exceeded the target that is prescribed in the clean fuel standards, then you're going to have revenue coming in, new revenue. Now, is that revenue going to be refunded to drivers, those who pay for gasoline and diesel at the pump, or are they only going to be paying the cost? It sounds to me, the way this is set up, they're only going to be paying the costs. So this is one of the problems with this this carbon adjuster approach. It's giving the opportunity for the refinery to pass on the costs of investments that a smart company, and Irving Oil is a smart company, that those investments are going to be made in a way that is going to generate benefits to the company. It's going to, I'm sure, will generate the ability to sell credits. It will generate new streams of revenue for them that otherwise wouldn't happen if the clean fuel standard wasn't in place. But those revenues are not going to benefit the drivers, the consumers of gasoline and diesel. They will benefit Irving Oil. But the cost will be passed on. So there used to be this concept in the country, Mr. Chair, called polluter pays principle. But in this case, it's not the polluter paying. The costs are being passed on to the wholesalers and retailers, and this would enable the UB to ensure that they can be passed on to the costs reflected in the price of fuel to the consumer. So why would that not be a disincentive to make the investments, the best investments, if the costs actually are passed on to the consumer, rather than investing in a way that is going to significantly not only achieve the modest targets in reducing the carbon intensity of the fuels produced at the refinery, but exceed those so that Irving Oil is in the position of being able to play on the credit market and sell the credits they accumulate.
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, there's a few things that were said in that we got to talk about here for a second. The member opposite, I'd like to know if he's ever handled a balance sheet or ran an organization or invested significant capital into an organization as a result to get an end result, because I've never heard a conversation. Okay, separate and part. Let's take this outside of the Irving Oil conversation. What the member opposite is saying is that a corporation is going to make significant large-scale investments in their organization in order to comply with regulations that are being imposed upon them. And the member opposite is saying, my heavens, that'll get passed on. Show me a private sector situation anywhere in the world where significant capital investment that's required for the operation of doing business doesn't wind up finding its way throughout the supply chain and ultimately to consumers. The importance behind that is that if they're selling credits, okay, two comments there. You're saying that these corporations are going to pass down costs. There isn't a corporation on the planet that does not do that. And the other, where you started, was with the credit conversation. They're going to get these credits and then make revenue. Well, this is revenue. Anything that is revenue generated is also subject to the EUB auspice and the review to ensure that that's considered in the whole process of discussing margin rates. Two things that you're talking about here, and two of them are grossly misrepresentative of real life. Mr. Chair, would the member opposite say that corporations that invest in their companies take that hit completely and don't pass costs on throughout supply chains? Would the member opposite talk about the fact that selling credits is a revenue source? Absolutely, but it's not a revenue source that winds up being able to be stuffed in a pocket and hidden. It also comes under review and analysis as well. So when you peel everything down, Mr. Chair, it's concerning that, again, the member opposite is talking about passing along cost and supply chains and hiding EUB credits versus talking about the bill.
What we're trying to get at, Mr. Chair, is whether there is a need for this carbon adjuster. That's what we're trying to get at. And the minister has not made his case because he keeps saying there's going to be these huge costs to comply, but he's got no evidence that there's going to be huge costs to comply. What those costs are, we don't know. He hasn't presented those. It seems to me, let me ask the minister, is that not the case? That there are all kinds of opportunities when you make significant investments as an industrial operation, like a refinery, to write those off through the federal tax process.
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, let's talk about the need for a carbon adjuster. Maybe we don't, but by having it and having it in place so that if those investments are made and they meet requirements and it works out, the carbon adjustment program is in place to allow for that transition. If they don't qualify, they don't get it. It's as simple as that, Mr. Chair. So to say, why do we even need this, is because when we put legislation together, we try to take a look at the holistic picture, and a very real holistic picture, and evidenced by investments that are currently taking place at the refinery here in New Brunswick, is significant capital will be outlaid. If they don't, then they won't have the ability to apply and have an adjuster bring them in a situation of getting a credit. But having it there is showing that legislation is being put together in a forthright fashion, taking into consideration all potential areas where we may have to be ready, rather than have to come back and say, you know, we've got a situation here, let's open this, let's do that. We looked at it and we're putting legislation together that will put a carbon adjuster in place, absolutely. If it is required, it can be applied for. If the investments aren't made, it won't be. It's essentially, you know, we put locks on our cars to make sure that we don't anticipate them to be broken into, but the protection is there. We have all sorts of things that we put in place that we don't use every day, but it's built into the system so that we're ready for it if a situation arises. We feel like the situation could arise. We do believe that there is significant investment going to be made in the sector. The federal government recognizes it as well. It's naive for anybody to sit in this House and say that we can't arrive at meeting the clean fuel standards without significant investment. We're reflecting that with a carbon adjuster. We go from there. If it's needed and justified, the refineries have an opportunity to put it forward. If it's not, it'll be declined.
Mr. Chair, I'm pleased that the minister keeps describing this as a significant investment, because investments have a rate of return. Investments have a payoff for the company that makes the investments, and that's exactly what we're going to see in this case. But let's talk about the process by which the carbon adjuster will be determined, or the value of the carbon adjuster will be determined. So in the bill, in Section 13, it says the board shall set the cost of the carbon adjuster and the market adjuster, for that matter, at any time the board considers appropriate, using a criteria and procedure as determined by the board. So how does the minister see that process unrolling? Will that automatically mean a hearing to determine what the cost of the carbon adjuster should be, or what's that process going to look like?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite. First of all, again, the member opposite is using business terms out of context. When he got up, he said he was happy to hear me say that there's going to be significant investments because that's going to lead to a return on investment. In the corporate world, a return on investment is a result of seeing an opportunity, investing in it, and understanding that that can then turn around and increase the opportunity, the profitability, whatever the case may be, and I'll get a return on that investment. This is not the case in this situation. This is a federal clean fuel standard that's being imposed upon these businesses. If the member opposite had an ounce of experience in the private sector, he would not stand and say something as naive as investments are coming in this sector, so that must mean there's a return on investment. That statement's either uneducated or inflammatory, but either way, it's very important that it needs to be corrected. Now, as it relates to this, we can't say because the board is going to put this together, but we anticipate that a hearing will be held.
So, Mr. Chair, just to that last point, as I had said earlier, you have to work off the evidence. And the evidence is, when it comes to the world of pollution control, smart companies actually make investments. They don't see it as costs. They see it as investments, and there are examples after examples after examples in this country of where those investments were made as a result of complying with legal requirements of new pollution measures, anti-pollution measures, that paid off well for the companies in the long term, because they actually were investments. Why would you spend money on something to comply with, in this case, clean fuel standards, in a way that didn't take advantage of the opportunity to treat it as an investment and generate a return for your company at the same time? It wouldn't be very smart. Irving Oil is a smart company, and I'm sure that's what they're going to do. So with respect to how the process is going to work around setting the cost of carbon adjusters, it does say that the criterion procedure will be determined by the board. So it doesn't sound like necessarily a hearing will be triggered automatically at the start of the process, but they could do that. It also, in Section 14, 2.1, says the board may, on the request of a wholesaler or retailer, or on its own motion, conduct a review of the cost of carbon adjuster to ensure that it's justified in light of clean fuel regulations. So with respect to this section and the language in it, that the board may conduct a review of the cost of the carbon adjuster, does this, just to confirm, does this review look like a conventional hearing that the EUB would hold, where there would be interveners, and the interveners would submit interrogatories, and there would be then an in-person hearing where evidence would be presented, and the board would rule on the cost of the carbon adjuster in the end? Is that what it would look like, or would the review take some other form?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, that's up to the EUB.
So that's something to ask the EUB in that case, I guess. Mr. Chair, those pretty much are my questions. As I said when I began, it was really just my interest in this bill specifically, given the other questions that were asked, was on the carbon adjuster, the rationale for it, how it would be calculated, and what that actual process might be. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for your good efforts, and to the Minister and his staff for their help with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, did you want to comment on that, or? No? Okay. Any other member from Madawaska, Edmondson?
Edmondson, Madawaska Centre. That's good. That's good enough. J'ai, Monsieur le Président, une question pour le ministre. À sa première réponse, le ministre a parlé de l'impact, que le projet de loi était là, entre autres, pour s'assurer de l'impact des juridictions qui sont à proximité du Nouveau-Brunswick. J'ai compris que principalement on parlait de la Nouvelle-Écosse pour s'ajuster. Il y a juste une réalité, puis souvent cette réalité-là est oubliée. Le Nouveau-Brunswick n'est peut-être pas une grande province, mais elle a des particularités un peu partout à travers ses quatre coins. Le ministre mentionnait la Nouvelle-Écosse. C'est bien quand tu es à proximité de la Nouvelle-Écosse, puis tu es dans la région du sud-est. Mais lorsque tu es dans la région du nord-ouest, la réalité est complètement différente. Et puis, le ministre parlait de s'assurer de mitiger l'impact des autres juridictions. J'aimerais rappeler au ministre qu'il existe une particularité, comme je l'ai mentionné, mais une distorsion relativement énorme entre la région du Madawaska, je vais prendre le Madawaska à titre d'exemple, et l'État du Maine. Où est-ce que la différence peut être de 20 sous, 30 sous, 40 sous de différence du litre? Puis ça ne peut pas seulement être des taxes, parce qu'à un moment donné, eux aussi ont des taxes, donc ça ne peut pas seulement être des taxes. Donc là, si on veut régler à l'intérieur de ce projet de loi-là la problématique avec d'autres juridictions limitrophes, comme la Nouvelle-Écosse, est-ce que le ministre peut expliquer qu'est-ce que ce projet de loi-là va faire pour s'assurer que les gens vivant dans la région du nord-ouest de la province pourront avoir la même chance que d'autres d'un ajustement pour s'assurer que les prix entre la région du Madawaska, du nord-ouest, et les prix qui est retrouvé en dollars canadiens du côté de l'État du Maine puissent se ressembler. Donc, j'aimerais entendre le ministre sur cela par rapport au projet de loi qui nous concerne aujourd'hui.
Monsieur le Président, merci pour la première question à mon nouveau critique à énergie. Les 7 critiques pour moi dans le département d'énergie. So, bienvenue and welcome. Welcome to the crew. Now I've got 7 critics. What do we got? 13 members over there. 2 more years left. I'm hoping to get to double digits by the time we arrive at the 2024 election. Mais merci pour la question, Monsieur le Président. I can't speak to U.S. jurisdictions. There are a variety of different things that are different than that, than what we deal with here, here in the province of New Brunswick or the country of Canada. We refer to the harmonization of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick because there's geographical proximity where it's very easy to see in a Canadian province. There are nuances to U.S. pricing that is different than us, but I would suggest that maybe the member opposite speak to his federal cousins as it relates to the carbon tax. If we were able to have that removed off of fuel, we would see ourselves in a much more cost-effective situation.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je tiens à féliciter le ministre pour ses efforts en français. Je vais lui rappeler de l'autre côté, lorsque j'étais le critique de la santé, j'ai eu la chance de changer 3 fois de ministre. Donc, si le ministre des Ressources naturelles est intéressé à m'avoir comme critique, comme son critique, bien, je pense qu'il devrait réfléchir à 2 fois parce qu'il parle ici, il parle avec ses collègues, il va peut-être changer d'idée. Hein? Mais c'est correct, Monsieur le Président, c'est de bonne guerre. Mais ça demeure que ce que le ministre a donné comme réponse, c'est pas, lorsqu'on parle de proximité, j'ai juste utilisé les termes que le ministre lui-même a mentionnés. Si on est capable de s'ajuster, parce que comprenons bien là, que l'ajustement qui a été fait, exemple, mercredi, il y a eu un ajustement de prix mercredi, puis en dedans de 24 heures, je pense qu'il y a encore eu un ajustement de prix, mais là, à la hausse. Donc, à un moment donné, il faut un équilibre là-dedans. Je comprends que la clause, la switch là, qui est élevée pour pouvoir baisser le prix lorsqu'il y a une différence de plus de 6 sous, de 6 cents, c'est bien. Mais c'est juste que ça vient rapide, que l'augmentation le lendemain se fait. Donc, ça devient difficile à suivre pour les citoyens. Mais je reviens encore. Le ministre peut répéter ce qu'il veut par rapport au fédéral. Ici, là, on est à l'Assemblée législative du Nouveau-Brunswick. Lorsqu'on se compare avec la Nouvelle-Écosse, c'est à cause qu'on se compare entre provinces, entre juridictions provinciales. Et puis, j'aimerais rappeler au ministre que lorsqu'on regarde l'État du Maine, ça pourrait être considéré aussi bien l'équivalent d'une province si on était à l'intérieur d'un même tout, mais ce n'est pas le cas. Donc, qu'est-ce que le ministre est prêt à faire ou qu'est-ce que son projet de loi aujourd'hui va faire comme différence pour les citoyens qui demeurent dans le Nord-Ouest, qui ont à regarder d'un côté de la rivière, parce que c'est ça, que ce soit des gens qui demeurent à Edmundston ou à Clare ou à Saint-Léonard, qui regardent Van Buren, Madawaska, Fort Ken, puis ils se disent « C'est beau, là, mais comment ça qu'on a 20, 30, 40 cents de différence le litre en dollars canadiens avec qu'est-ce qui se passe au Nouveau-Brunswick? » Donc, le ministre n'aurait pas cru bon d'avoir à l'intérieur de son projet de loi une modification permettant un ajustement, entre autres, des taxes du Nouveau-Brunswick afin de pouvoir permettre aux stations-service du Nord-Ouest d'avoir une compétitivité avec les stations-service de l'État du Maine et puis, en même temps, s'assurer que les citoyens puissent avoir un prix raisonnable et puis que les gens continuent à remplir leur voiture d'essence qui est en provenance du Nouveau-Brunswick ou du Canada. Donc, je vais attendre la réponse, puis on verra si j'ai une autre question. Mais dépendant de la réponse du ministre, je vais peut-être avoir une autre question.
Monsieur le Président, merci pour la question. Le prix de gaz Québec au Nouveau-Brunswick, le prix de gaz Nouvelle-Écosse est le même, juste le même. So we've got Quebec, we've got Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick in the middle. PEI, the gas price is a little bit higher. And I appreciate where the member opposite is going with that. And I know that members who stood in this legislature from the northwest of the province have vigorously stood up for their region and wanted to make sure that it was equitable and fair. And it is equitable and fair as it relates to fuel prices in the Canadian province of Quebec. It will be equitable and fair as it relates to the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, but there are nuances and differences that make it very difficult for us to try to find harmonization in Maine. And I'm going to break that down. We do have a little bit of fun here in the legislature, but my effort will be to give a significant and serious answer to the question. There is a significant tax differential with the state of Maine versus the province of New Brunswick. It is. It is an unregulated market in Maine, and you can see significant switches and swings in the prices from the Aroostook counties in Maine down to the Portland area in Maine. The price does swing, even though it's significantly lower than us. It's an unregulated market, so all bets are off, so to speak. So I am dealing in a regulated market where we've got a border that's probably about 400 or 500 kilometers long, and I guess the question would be, if we start creating tax differentials within the boundaries and borders of the province of New Brunswick, where does it end? You know, at some point, St. Stephen could come and say, we've now got an issue right across the border in Holton, or not Holton, Calais, yeah, Calais winds up. Woodstock turns around and says, yeah, I know, well, Edmundston's here, but they've actually dropped it lower over in Holton. So we could wind up getting into a regional disparity within the tax structure of the province of New Brunswick. I feel like that the idea, the thought, and the question from the member opposite was very well intended, and the idea is good. I would never question a member standing and reaching out and trying to stand up for the best interest of their region. There are complicating factors that would make what we're trying to do as a simple harmonization of regulation and turn it into something that could be a mosaic that's very difficult to manage and regulate in the province of New Brunswick, due to the fact that the unregulated entity right next to us has such a large swing and differences from one end of the top of the border to the other. It doesn't mean that we can't continue to look towards finding ways, and I encourage the member opposite to continue to ask questions to me in the House, in the legislature. You guys can fight over me all you want. You know, I will be quite happy to accept questions from any member from the Liberal Party. I find it to be good practice, and I look forward to it. So that being the case, we need to continue to have that conversation in the regular sessions of the legislature, in the regular work that we're doing, like the work that we're doing to invest in food banks, like we're doing to do heat pump programs, get people off oil. I'm talking from my own frame of reference here. You know, it has to be all hands on deck. We have to figure out every way we can to bring relief to New Brunswickers. I know that in our own department we've gone forward with some initiatives, and my critic, the member from Tracadie-Shiloh, has been very quick to point out the areas and keep us in line to make sure that we are continually correcting and moving in the direction of the intended outcome that we're looking for. We need to continue to do that, but based on what I said, that's the reason why I would say it's difficult to put together a piecemeal component of fuel pricing in the province of New Brunswick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you know, listening to the minister, I understand, but you know, he point the member from St. Stephen. He can talk with you know, his colleague from Woodstock, and I'm sure that both will say, listen, we should look at it, and to try to understand what can be done. As you know, for the people of Northwestern New Brunswick, they are saying the same thing. What can be done? And I'm taking the answer of Minister, Mr. Chair, and I'm perplexed because, you know, in the center of the country, we'll take the province of Ontario as an example. They have a boundary with Quebec, Ottawa, and Gatineau. And the province of Ontario decide to take their own responsibility on their provincial gas tax. And they decide to reduce that gas tax for a period of time. For them, initially it was for a few months, and they extended for different reasons, based on the cost of living and probably other reasons. But you know, that create a competition between, yes, the two borders, but the people who's living in Ontario have a chance to pay a lower gas price compared to those living on the other side of the Ottawa River. So, if that's the case, I mean, Ontario and Quebec have a long boundary also, probably longer than New Brunswick and the state of Maine. So if they are doing that, you know, we talk about, Minister talk, Mr. Chair, about the, you know, we don't have, the regulation is not there in Maine, the gas, the tax in Maine is not the same. Yeah, I agree. But Ontario and Quebec are not the same too. And they decide to apply some reduction to help their people. And the impact is not everywhere. You know, it's not everywhere that people can cross between Ontario and Quebec. So I'm wondering what is now the position of the minister, Mr. Chair, and you know, instead of, you know, and yes, he was serious with the last answer, but I think that we should think about venue way to make sure that we can help people living in area where there's a border with another with a state.
Monsieur le Président, merci pour la question. The short answer to that is yes. I mean, we should be considering anything and everything when it comes to what can we do to assist and help our New Brunswickers. Now, not all provinces are considered equal. I'll use Ontario, for example. I just returned from Ontario this week, and we're excited about the fact that New Brunswick is growing. We've reached 810, 12, whatever, thousand people. That's awesome. That's wonderful. And then I drive by a sign saying, "Welcome to Mississauga, population 1.2 million." Right? And I was like, whoa, okay. You know, that was something that gave me an opportunity to realize that, you know, in context, you know, we are growing, we are on the move, our age is dropping, all that stuff. But relatively speaking, not every province is indeed equal. So I don't think you'll see each and every province mimic and mirror the initiatives that different provinces are doing. There's differentials between resources, capacities, et cetera, et cetera. However, what I want to talk about is the fact that that's a conversation that is philosophical almost in nature, and I agree with and say that, yes, we need to continue to look at something. We want to make sure that we do things that don't have unintended consequences and create a domino effect that'll create more confusion, because in government, confusion is the equivalent of a lack of activity and an increase in expense, and we all want to work to it. And I know that the members opposite, as well as us, want to see that we get stuff done versus clog up, create a logjam. So, that being the case, I hearken back to a speech that I did last Thursday as it relates to motion 7 that was brought forward by the opposition related to investments. And so we during that conversation acknowledged that we certainly aren't in a perfect situation. However, we've put together, I listed over $250 million worth of different assistance that's being offered. We look forward to members opposite saying, yeah, but what about this? And can you add that? And in legitimate and seriousness, the member from Tracadie-Shiloh, as my critic, has had, I believe, very sincere conversations with me about where some of these initiatives are good, but more importantly, a sincere conversation about where they miss the mark and where we have to correct the drift. So to the member opposite, that answer is yes, but that's a conversation that is ongoing. It involves the whole scope of government, both opposition and the governing side, but separate and apart from the bill that we're discussing here today. Again, merci pour la question.
Merci, merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le ministre. And, you know, I honestly, since the minister answered initially to my question a yes, that we need to find ways, I think it's, you know, I pushed the pressure on him, and it's now his responsibility to go to cabinet and making sure that when the next budget will be presented at the beginning of 2023, we'll see a change, if it's not before. But I think now it's time to do something and making sure that we are understanding the realities of different parts of the province. And why I'm saying that, and I'm not asking the minister to answer this one, but why I'm saying that, it's, I remember during the pandemic, we are still fighting a little bit, but in the core, in the middle of the pandemic, some decision was made here in Fredericton. Talking, you know, like example, if somebody is entering the province, they need to isolate themselves in an hotel room. And the decision was, you enter in Edmundston, but you need to go to Fredericton or Campbellton. Make no sense. There's hotel in the Madawaska area, hotels with an S. So it's just to say that we need to understand the particularity of each region of the province. And I really hope that in the near future, the minister will take you know, his own word and talk with cabinet and colleagues that he have on his side, and working on something about gas price in Northwest New Brunswick or any boundaries with the state of Maine. So thank you very much. Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci au ministre pour sa réponse.
Thank you. Minister, do you have comments to that? Or, okay, any further questions? Member from Fredericton South.
Thanks. One further question I forgot to ask, Mr. Chair, was regarding the carbon cost adjuster. So why, my question is why this is being why these costs are being singled out. So this is designed to address particularly the costs the refinery would incur in complying with the clean fuel regulation. But is it not the case that any other costs that the refinery, expenditures the refinery makes, there's a means through the process to pass those on? Why? I mean, that's not how the process works. That ultimately, the major expenditures that the refinery get passed down to the consumer. Why separate out the carbon compliance costs with this carbon adjuster rather than treating them as any other major expenditures might be treated in the regulatory process?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, other costs are captured in the marketplace, and these are costs that are imposed upon the industry by federal government clean fuel standards, and typically are not in a situation when something's imposed that you have the same ability to recover costs. So therefore, costs imposed upon the industry as a result of clean fuel standards that are investments that are being made to comply and accommodate to that are allowed versus regular investments and whatnot that the regular course of doing business would allow the accommodation for.
Just to clarify that answer then, Mr. Chair, when the province brought in its regulations on putting a price on carbon for industry in the province, it didn't feel the need to establish any kind of an adjuster mechanism to address that, those costs associated with paying the carbon tax on a portion of the refinery's emissions. So what's the difference? I mean, those are costs that the province is imposing on the refinery by regulation and other industry by regulation, and that's through legislation. This is the same thing. In that case, they didn't feel the need to put in place a carbon adjuster for the EUB, despite the increased costs of paying for emissions from the refinery, but they have felt the need to provide the EUB with a carbon adjuster to deal with the costs associated with complying with the clean fuel standards. What's the difference?
Mr. Chair, the member opposite, we have control over those investments, and the recycling of that revenue, we hope to be able to make appropriate investments to accommodate and accomplish the goals.
I didn't understand, Mr. Chair, the answer. If the minister could expand a little bit with an example, would be great.
Chair, the member opposite, output-based pricing will allow for revenue to be generated indeed. It is revenue that will be generated from the industry, which therefore can be then applied for the purpose of investments in the industry to meet and accommodate climate change goals and the reduction of emissions. Keep in mind that that would be negated as revenue in the EUB discussion as it relates to carbon adjustment, most likely.
That's clearer. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the minister.
No, any further questions? Minister, do you have any closing remarks?
Mr. Chair, to the member opposite, it's very good to be able to stand here and have a conversation about a bill that is complicated in nature. The member from Tracadie-Shiloh talked about the complicated nature of it. The member from Fredericton South spoke about many of the nuances of it. And the member from Madawaska talked about the way that it can be applied to benefit all New Brunswickers. So this is something that affects everybody. So we take it very seriously when we have a chance to stand and talk about something like that. I appreciate all of the questions from all of the members as it relates to this bill. I very much appreciate my staff who are here today to discuss it, and we look forward to bringing this forward and bringing that balance to New Brunswickers as it relates to fuel pricing in the province of New Brunswick. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. We'll just ask staff to step out and we'll do our vote. Is it the pleasure of the committee that Bill number 15, an act respecting petroleum products pricing, stand as presented and I report the bill as agreed to? All those in favor, please say yea. Yea. Against, nay. Carried. We are adjourned.